because that was our dating relationship, and again, we were married at this point in time. The nonverbal skills, we talked about indirect communication, because ideally in a collective, I know Brian so well, I know what he wants. As a matter of fact, it's interesting. Brian comes to my house for lunch. He comes to my house around lunchtime. We haven't set it up. We haven't said he'll come for lunch. The fact that he and I are part of the same collective means I have an obligation to feed him lunch. He might not even be thinking lunch at the time, because in his mind it's not an imposition to come to me at that point in time. That's what friends do. So he drops by, and if I'm really a collective, I'll know that Brian likes turkey. So instead of asking him, what meat would you like on your sandwich, I just make you a turkey sandwich. I say, here's a turkey sandwich. And even if you don't want turkey that day, you'll just say, oh, great, thanks. Because that's part of our obligation to each other. So again, we focus on the nonverbal skills. Typically, shame is a part of it. Shame as it ties both to the individual and the group. But you have to remember this, especially the group. I don't want Brian to engage in activity that will shame the group. So if I see him doing that, I will likely stop him. Again, back to an illustration of China. In many Chinese university settings, women sit on one side and men on the other. There's a gender separation in the classrooms. Not always, but that's true in a number of places. And one day, a teacher noticed that a woman was sitting among the men. And she thought, okay, this is strange. Situation the same the next day. Finally, after a week of this in class, she asked some of the female students after class, what's going on? Oh, that girl is having a relationship with a boy and we don't approve of it. So we're not letting her sit with us. So in other words, by shunning her, they were shaming her, and the fact that she had to sit with the men publicly displayed their displeasure with her. They didn't need to say anything to anyone. People would make their own assumptions about what was happening, but people would see she's being shamed for some reason, and the goal was to drive her to come back to the group because of her public shame. What happens if you do that with an American? You publicly shame them to bring them back to the group. All you're going to do is make an enemy for life. And this is part of what can happen if Asian ministries try and operate in Asian fashion in an American setting. But then you also have to realize how we handle disciplinary measures will look strange to them as well too. And it's the face of the group that's important. So, as I mentioned before on the cheating issue, the fact that my grade means something to the face of the room and all my roommates means Brian is going to help me on the exam because he wants face for all of us and he doesn't want shame for all of us. And you can see how the social pressures weigh on people from collective settings to make decisions that relate along these lines in terms of shame and face. On the individualistic side, this lecture is a perfect example of being abstract in principles. I'm giving you examples tied off into it, but this slide itself is an individualistic slide. Now, as I tell stories, I make it fit in a more collectivistic framework. But remember, I mentioned how I did sermons in Africa. Instead of giving you this slide, I would simply be telling you stories. And the stories would reinforce the values I want you to hear. Individualists tend to be more distant in terms of physical proximity to each other. And they don't engage in as much touch within the gender roles, within the genders in public. They focus on verbal skills. As an individualist, it's up to me to get friends and to earn friends. I have to engage in behavior that's going to do that for me. Verbal behavior is valued there. We tend to focus on guilt, so we come to the stoplight at 2 a.m. in the desert, and we are more likely to stop than those from shame cultures, because if it's wrong no matter who's watching. And part of our goal would say to Brian, who wants to help me, is no, that's wrong, you can never do that. But the reality is Brian is facing multiple pressures, not just one pressure to not do the wrong thing. So that's why in the 1980s we could have a drug campaign in the United States. Just say no. And it was built on this foundation of individualism, ignoring social context. And so my daughters all went through the DARE program. And it was a program designed to help fifth graders at the time were going through the program, help them say no to opportunities to do drugs. And they actually, 7 ways to say no when you're given opportunity to do drugs, and they would role play with each other, those things. They were practicing in an individualistic framework how to say no to the opportunities, because the idea was peer pressure doesn't matter, you can say no. The empowerment of the individual, which is a very individualistic element, and then self-respect as opposed to face. Face, if you want to think of it this way, and we'll get to this a little bit more in honor, is almost like a credit rating that you have. So you go to buy a car and you get a score based on the amount of money you have out, the amount of money you're allowed to borrow, how good you've been on your payments. Face is like that in many cultures in the world, and your face depends in part on your age, in part on the social status, in part on your education, but in very large part on the family you grew up in. And so that's all part of the picture that we have to watch in terms of this. Okay, so when I look at family ties, Acts 15, this gigantic fight between Paul and Barnabas. After some time, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit each city where we previously preached the word of the Lord to see how the new believers are doing. This is after the Jerusalem Council. Barnabas agreed and wanted to take along John Mark. But Paul disagreed strongly since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. The disagreement was so sharp, they separated. What was driving this? Was it a disagreement over principles? Well, look at the second point there on the right. Barnabas took his cousin, Colossians 4:10, John Mark, with him and sailed for Cyprus. So in other words, this was a family issue. This isn't a collectivist issue. Paul was not related to John Mark. He didn't have to stand up for him. He deserted us. Barnabas, on the other hand, felt he had a family obligation to stand up for John Mark. Even though he had deserted them, he's my cousin. I can't let down family. It's one of the realities you find with leaders in ministry who in collective societies often are trapped. They cannot step down from leadership because their entire collective has the possibility of losing unless they turn the leadership over to someone in their collective, like a son or perhaps a daughter. And so this helps you get a sense of, yes, collectivism, individualism plays itself out in the Bible. Our names are written in the book of life. They're not written collectively. But most Americans really don't understand what body life is because we're trained to be independent and individual. And the interdependence of someone that's part of that is a challenge, to say the least. And we'll put this all together when we get to looking at honor, and especially when we begin to frame this in patron-client relationships and things like this. So related proverbs. On the collective side, a single banana does not grow bigger than the stalk. The bird that stands out will be shot first. Don't you like that one? A chicken is never ashamed of its coop. Brothers and sisters are as close as hands and feet. One piece of wood will not make a fire. That sounds very much like a crude saying that we would use about fellowship. A log burning by itself will burn out, but if you put several logs together, they'll burn brightly. And we use that idea to talk about your need to be involved in a local church. Well, here is a proverb from Laos. On the individualist side, these are American proverbs: live and let live, to each his own. Look out for number 1, be true to yourself. The customer is always right. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. So be squeaky. If you want something done right, do it yourself. God helps those who help themselves. That Old Testament passage that I mentioned previously, right? So when we're talking way of life, if you're talking an individualist, that's the way of life. You have to determine your own path and chart it all out. If you're talking a collectivist, you do it together as a group. You think back to the video Jitencha, and the young man was being criticized by his co-workers because he seemed to be separated from them. And Japan is a very collective culture. So what needed to happen to him is he needed to be reconnected to people. So when the pieces of his bicycle got missing and he was given addresses, he had to go find where those people were so that he could get parts of his bike back. But in connecting his bike, he was connecting to people at the same time. If you're going to a party, This is always a fascinating one to me. In an individual society, you go to a party and you find people grouped in twos or threes. You go to a collective society, and it's a large ring of people. And if you've ever been to parties in China or other places like that, it's a kind of as much of a circle as you can make in the apartment. Everyone sits around in that type of circle so that we're all there together. We don't cluster in individual sets. If you want private time, interestingly enough, you'll go outside of the apartment or the place where the party is being held to talk with somebody. But if you're going to be in the group, then everything is open and fair game to everyone that's part of the group. In terms of connections, in the individual setting, when I look around in this class, some of you have connections to each other individually. Some of you are connected by virtue of the fact that this is your last course. Some of you are connected by the fact that this is your first course. On one side, you're all together, but compare that to the connections in a collective society. It's interesting to consider secrets in a collective society. Is there such a thing? And that's why sometimes Americans are misled, might be too strong of a word, but Americans who teach in Asian settings, who tell them that students open up and they tell the American teachers things they've never told anyone else. Why? Americans are disconnected from the social context. They're safe to talk about those things. It doesn't mean I want to be your best friend. Instead, it means I can talk with you about this. I want a friendship. I want a relationship. But you're safe because you're not going to let everybody else know what's going on. In collective societies, there are very few secrets. And the reality is, in telling one person, you're anticipating everybody is going to find out. It doesn't always work that way, but it's far more that way than it is in North American setting.